100 missiles at one of our aircraft carriers, the Abraham Lincoln, one of the biggest ships in the world, actually. And out of 101 missiles shot, every single one of them was knocked down in the sea.
In other news overseas tonight, an American aircraft carrier and 3 destroyers have arrived in the Middle East. It is a show of force after President Trump warned. In some other news, we are learning that a second U.S. aircraft carrier is being sent to the Middle East. And here is what we are learning from the Associated Press. They are reporting that the United States will send the world's largest aircraft carrier there. They say the United States is crushing the radical Iranian regime's military in a way the world has never seen before. At 4:13 a.m. local time on March 24, 2026, in the scenario every naval planner in the Gulf fears most, a concrete service building 14 miles northeast of Bandar Abbas receives a single encrypted burst over military UF. The burst lasts less than half a second. One code, one release authority, one action. Deep beneath a compound listed on paper as irrigation support infrastructure, hydraulic clamps unlock around a launch canister sealed inside a reinforced underground bay. When the blast doors split apart, the weapon inside is finally exposed to the night air, an Iranian Al-Qadr ballistic missile, a 2,000 km range system changed for a terminal maneuver profile its designers were never supposed to perfect. For the next 11 minutes, it becomes the most dangerous object in the Strait of Hormuz. 71 miles to the southwest, the US George Washington cuts through the western approach to Hormuz at 14 knots. It is centered inside a carrier strike group spread across layered defensive rings of cruisers, destroyers, helicopters, and combat air patrol. Fully loaded, the carrier displaces just over 100,000 tons. More than 5,000 sailors are aboard. On the flight deck sit parked aircraft, fuel lines, munitions, elevators, and enough combat power to control a regional battle space for days. Floating inside that steel mass is one of the most expensive groups of military power on Earth. And in this scenario, the entire strike group has been pulled into a kill chain designed to crack it open in minutes. If you want the full picture, hit like right now so this story reaches more people before the noise buries it. What the strike group does not know yet is that the Al-Qadr is not the first weapon launched that morning. At 4:09 a.m., 4 minutes before the main launch order is carried out, a disguised coastal cargo barge drifting north of Keshem Island opens a false deck panel and lifts a compact launcher hidden beneath fishing nets and diesel drums. From that improvised platform, an Iranian Fateh 110 variant lifts off in a low ballistic arc. It is not aimed at the carrier, it is aimed at the outer defensive screen. Its job is not to kill. Its job is to force a decision. 9 seconds after ignition, the launch is classified by the Spy-1 radar aboard the cruiser US Normandy. The track appears real, fast, and headed for the northeastern defensive lane of the formation. Inside the Combat Information Center, the threat is labeled immediate but manageable. The Normandy responds exactly the way Iranian planners expected. At 4:10 and 18 seconds, one Standard Missile-3 rises out of the cruiser's forward vertical launch cells in a clean white column of exhaust. The interceptor costs roughly $10 million. It climbs hard, rolls into its engagement geometry, and collides with the incoming Fateh high above the Gulf at 4:12 and 39 seconds. Clean intercept. Debris over open water. One threat is erased, but the kill creates the exact window Iran wanted. Because while the Normandy is dealing with the decoy, the real weapon is already moving. At 4:13 and 24 seconds, the Al-Qadr's first stage ignites beneath the agricultural compound northeast of Bandar Abbas. The blast punches through a vented service shaft. It bends a steel cover plate off its hinges and throws it into a nearby irrigation channel. The thermal bloom is so intense that every infrared sensor looking at the eastern Gulf reads the launch instantly. Iran is not trying to hide this missile. They are trying to squeeze the timeline so hard that every American decision becomes reactive instead of planned. The missile clears the shaft, rolls slightly west, and begins climbing. The plume is stable. The acceleration profile is clean. And then the first bad number appears on American screens. The trajectory solution does not center on safety, it centers on the George Washington. Comment shield below. If you think modern naval warfare is really a battle of timing more than firepower, the Normandy's fire control team runs the geometry in seconds and finds a problem. The Al-Qadr is not flying a textbook medium-range ballistic profile. During the climb, its upper section shows a small attitude adjustment, then a correction burn after boost. Not big, not dramatic, just enough to shift the predicted re-entry lane farther southwest than the first track suggested. In practical terms, that means the interceptor shot is no longer ideal. Instead of meeting a stable ballistic target at a comfortable angle, the cruiser now has to reach into a changing corridor and hit a missile whose final descent path is still moving. The shot is taken anyway. At 4:14 3 two SM-3 block Aya interceptors leave the Normandy in a ripple salvo less than 3 seconds apart. More than $50 million in missile defense leaves the ship before most people on land would even understand a crisis had begun. The first interceptor climbs to the edge of its engagement envelope and gets contact geometry at exoatmospheric altitude. The second follows on nearly the same line, set to back up the kill if the first only damages the target. The first SM-3 reaches the Al-Qadr at extreme closing speed and smashes into the upper body of the missile at 4:15 21. The collision destroys the booster structure. Panels, insulation fragments, and fuel residue spread outward in a glittering cloud above the Gulf. For a fraction of a second, it looks like the intercept worked perfectly. Then, the real danger appears. The Al-Qadr's maneuvering re-entry vehicle separates cleanly from the destruction event. Iranian engineers built the payload section to survive terminal stress, and in this scenario, that design choice changes everything. The warhead is no longer attached to its main body, but it is not tumbling, it is not blind, it is not dead. It is carrying its own compact inertial guidance package and a limited maneuvering system meant to keep the final strike corridor, even if the missile body is damaged during intercept. The second SM-3 reaches the debris field seconds later. Instead of hitting an intact missile, it slams into the expanding remains of the upper stage and has only a partial effect on the re-entry vehicle. The result is important, but incomplete. The strike strips part of the warhead's outer thermal shielding and destabilizes one side of its protective casing. It does not stop the descent. Now, the carrier strike group has a hypersonic, partly damaged, still-guided warhead falling toward its center. Type yes if you want to see every layer of this strike group pushed right to the edge. Aboard the George Washington, Ship Defense Condition 1 is already underway. The flight deck snaps into controlled chaos. Aircraft staged for launch are shoved back from the catapults. Yellow shirts sprint. Ordnance crews clear exposed pathways. Fuel lines are isolated. In barely more than a minute, the deck shifts from pre-dawn launch posture to survival posture. The carrier turns harder into new water, increasing speed to widen the predicted miss geometry by every meter possible. But there is only so much 100,000 tons of steel can do against a descending weapon traveling several times the speed of sound. The close-in systems come alive in sequence. Rolling airframe missile launchers rotate to standby position. Electronic warfare suites prepare decoys and jamming packages. Phalanx mounts swing and lock into automatic engagement mode. Every defensive computer in the inner ring is now calculating the same brutal truth. If the warhead survives to terminal altitude, the window for a successful final kill will be measured in seconds, not minutes. And the missile is not the only pressure point in the scenario. 36 miles south of the carrier, the destroyer Truxtun has been holding contact on a submerged anomaly since 4:02 a.m. The sonar profile is faint, but consistent with an Iranian Ghadr-class submarine running slowly on battery power. The contact is small, patient, and positioned near a route the strike group would have to cross if forced into evasive maneuver. It has likely been waiting there for hours. That matters, because the longer a crew can sit silent inside a steel tube in warm Gulf water, waiting for a signal that might never come, the more disciplined the whole operation probably is. At 4:15 and 40 seconds, while attention across the task force is fixed upward on the descending warhead, the submarine begins moving. Not fast, just enough to suggest it is preparing for a shot, a relay, or a final position report. The Truxtun receives authorization to prosecute immediately. Her embarked MH-60R Seahawk, already airborne on a low orbit, shifts from passive tracking to attack geometry. A pair of Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes are released in a staggered spread. The cost is small compared to the missile fight overhead, but the goal is identical. Remove every extra variable before the main impact window closes. Hit share on this video right now so more people understand how deep a real layered strike can go before the first explosion even reaches the screen. The submarine hears the first torpedo too late in water that shallow, where maneuver choices are almost gone. The boat increases speed and tries to angle toward a cluttered bottom return near the northern bank, hoping terrain and noise will distort the incoming seeker. It does not work. The first torpedo locks on, detonates within lethal range, and cripples the hull. The second confirms the kill moments later. Whatever role that submarine was meant to play in the final attack sequence ends in a burst of pressure and steel fragments below the surface. Back above the Gulf, the real countdown is speeding up. At 4:16 and 49 seconds, the Al-Qadr warhead drops through 70,000 feet. Now, the damage from the partial SM-3 hit is creating a second problem for the weapon itself. One side of the reentry body is heating faster than the other. The guidance package is compensating, but every correction burns a little more of the limited control power available for the final dive. That does not make the weapon harmless. It makes it angry, unstable, and still very dangerous. Updated track estimates now place the impact ellipse across the forward third of the George Washington's flight deck, slightly to port of the centerline. That is the nightmare zone. Not because it guarantees the carrier sinks, but because it guarantees chaos if anything reaches it intact. On a deck like that, even a non-nuclear penetrator arriving at hypersonic speed threatens aircraft, fuel, ordnance handling, deck crews, and the sortie generation capacity that makes the carrier strategically valuable in the first place. This is where the outer exo-atmospheric defense ends and the atmosphere killers take over. The Normandy has been building a Standard Missile-6 solution since the moment the warheads separated. Unlike the SM-3, the SM-6 does not need to reach into space. It is built to hunt in the atmosphere, carrying an active radar seeker and a fragmentation warhead designed to destroy fast, maneuvering targets during terminal flight. At 4:17 and 12 seconds, the first SM-6 launches. 6 seconds later, a second follows behind it on a staggered track. If this level of planning shocked you, comment impact below right now. The first SM-6 climbs on a converging line as the Al-Qadr warhead begins its last violent descent. The Iranian payload still has lateral motion. It has not stopped maneuvering. It throws a small correction left, then another right, trying to keep the terminal path unpredictable and make seeker lock harder. But the earlier damage is working against it now. A thermal imbalance is growing. The reentry body is no longer perfectly balanced. Every correction costs more than it should. At just over 30,000 feet, the SM-6's seeker goes autonomous and locks the target. The missile no longer needs continuous ship guidance. It sees the warhead itself. The distance closes in seconds. The Al-Qadr makes one last lateral pull, a short, ugly move that shifts the predicted impact point, but also exposes even more of its damaged sidewall to the airflow. The SM-6 matches the move and detonates near the target in a burst of high-speed fragments. The effect is immediate but not total. The fragment cloud shreds the warhead's guidance section, punches through its outer body, and kills most of its remaining control power. But momentum keeps the mass moving. What is left is no longer a guided weapon. It is a ballistic wreck still falling toward the strike group as a hypersonic piece of metal and explosive structure. That is why the second SM-6 matters. 14 seconds behind the first, it receives the updated track and now has the easier problem. The target is damaged, not maneuvering, and more predictable. At 18,000 feet northeast of the carrier, the second interceptor closes, centers, and scores a direct hit. The remaining body of the Al-Qadr comes apart in a burst of glowing fragments that spread across open water, and no single large section survives long enough to threaten the George Washington. The debris field splashes down miles from the carrier's new track. On the bridge, the report comes in with the kind of calm that only exists after total chaos. Splash on the inbound track. From the Al-Qadr's ignition to the final terminal kill, the defensive response took just over 11 minutes. In that time, a decoy ballistic launch was intercepted. A maneuvering re-entry vehicle survived one defensive layer. A submarine threat was prosecuted below the surface. The carrier deck was cleared for survival, and two atmospheric interceptors finished a warhead seconds before it could enter lethal range of the flight deck. Now run the numbers, because this is where the deeper lesson appears. The opening decoy missile cost a fraction of the interceptor that killed it. The Al-Qadr, even with its modified terminal package, remains far cheaper than the layered American missiles required to stop it. 2 SM-3s, 2 SM-6s, combat air patrol fuel, torpedoes, helicopter sortie time, radar wear, and command system spending all pile into the response. Iran in this scenario is not trying to win a fair exchange. Iran is trying to force the United States into an expensive one. That is the whole logic behind saturation doctrine in confined water. You do not need every shot to land. You need enough pressure to make every defense cost more than every offense. But the exchange ratio is not the whole story, because the carrier is still operational. At 4:41 a.m., less than half an hour after the Al-Qadr launch, the counterstrike begins. FA-18E Super Hornets already armed for strike are retasked in flight. The coordinates of the launch compound northeast of Bandar Abbas were captured by overhead sensors before the missile even cleared the shaft. The pilots do not need to search, they only need to arrive. Each aircraft carries precision-guided bombs heavy enough to collapse buried access points, crater service roads, and destroy exposed support equipment around the compound. They hit in sequence. The first pair of bombs collapses the blast door approach and caves in part of the underground access corridor. The second pair tears through the utility section, feeding the launch bay. Follow-on munitions shred parked transport vehicles and cut the paved route that would have allowed the site to be reloaded or evacuated. By sunrise, smoke is still rising from the compound. Within hours, commercial satellite imagery would show scorched earth, broken concrete, and the unmistakable shape of a site that was never civilian, no matter what the paperwork said. And that is what makes this whole 11-minute sequence so important. Iran's strike logic in this scenario is sophisticated. A decoy launched to burn time and interceptors, a maneuvering Al-Qadr warhead to defeat a clean ballistic solution, a submarine placed in advance to threaten the strike group's maneuver space during maximum distraction. Each layer is real. Each layer is disciplined. Each layer pressures a different American decision cycle. On paper, it is smart. In isolation, any single layer might trouble any single ship. But a carrier strike group is not one ship. It is a network. That is the difference between what offensive planners hope for and what defenders build for. The George Washington is protected not by one wall, but by overlapping walls that share sensors, timing, and fire control. The cruiser's radar does not belong only to the cruiser. The destroyer's sonar does not matter only to the destroyer. The helicopter, the combat air patrol, the missile shooters, the electronic warfare teams, the bridge watch, the flight deck crews, all of them are feeding the same survival machine. Iran in this scenario built a sword designed to punch through a shield. America answered with multiple shields stacked inside each other, all looking through the same eyes. That is why the warhead never reached the deck. That is why the submarine never reached firing range. And that is why the carrier resumed operations while debris was still sinking into the Gulf. And that is why every serious planner in the region understands the same brutal lesson. Getting a missile into the air is not the same thing as getting past a network built to survive the first hit, classify the second, and kill the third before the smoke from the launch has even cleared. If this breakdown gave you something the headlines never do, hit like right now. Tell me in the comments which defensive layer matters most in a Hormuz fight. And subscribe, because the next video is going even deeper into how terminal missile defense really works when a maneuvering warhead comes screaming out of the